The Stone of Night, Book 1 of the Pathfinder's Code. Prologue, The Asset. Avron Ibali stepped through the threshold into the cavernous laboratory. The large room was dark. The sun-bright lanterns had been sabotaged. He had his own stone of stars, a small one on his wrist that he could use to give himself light, but he didn't. He didn't want to see what he was walking into. Besides, he wouldn't need it. Avron had spent more time in this lab over the last 10 years than he had in his own home. He could have navigated the tables and workstations with his eyes closed. He walked through the room, stepping carefully so that his footfalls didn't make noise. This room had been the center of his life, his and dozens of others. It had been filled with the sounds of human activity, the careful jostling of equipment and materials as they were arranged. Jubilant exclamations at each new discovery, the furious scratching of pencils at every new setback. Now it was still and completely silent, and Avron felt as though to disturb that silence was somehow profane. Avron rounded a desk and made for the center of the room. His foot caught something and he fell. He expected to hit the cold marble floor, but what he landed on was warm, liquid, and sticky. And pungent. Avron couldn't see it, but he could smell it. That hot, metallic odor that hung in the air around him, sticking to his hands and his clothes as he lay there. Holy origin, he could almost taste it. Blood. A lot of it. Panic took him over, and he fumbled with the watch-like device on his wrist. The Sombrite was fitted into the center of a circular brass setting. The outer ring of the setting could be made to rotate. Doing so would engage the inner mechanisms, causing 3 metal depressors to push inward towards the center, placing the Sombrite stone under pressure. Avron twisted the setting, activating the Stone of Stars. A pale light began to emanate from the stone. Avron held it high to cast as much light as he could. That was a mistake, and he knew as soon as he had done it. His lab coat, normally a light blue color, was now dark with red. He glanced over at his feet and saw what he had tripped on. Who he had tripped on. Khali. Her face had been slashed open. Her blood had leaked out into the floor in a pool she now lay in. Her eye, the one that hadn't been obliterated, was open. It seemed to stare directly at Avron. He retched, writhing in the pool of gore as his stomach twisted, and he had to fight to keep from vomiting. He clambered to his feet, slipping the whole way. Frantic, he dug out a cloth from his pocket and pressed it to his nose and mouth. His hands still had blood on them, and now, so did the cloth that touched his face, his mouth. He finally vomited. There wasn't much. He hadn't had time to eat anything before getting word of the attack. He had rushed to the lab, all other concerns forgotten. There was only one thing that mattered. That's right, he thought. I'm here for a reason. I have to know. Avron steeled himself and proceeded to the center of the room. The blood grew thicker, and he could feel it grabbing at his shoes as he stepped. There were more bodies, though Avron did his best to ignore them. He came to the containment unit, an enormous structure situated in the very middle of the room. It was shaped like a large metal pillar that connected the floor to the high ceiling. Avron lifted his wrist, shining his light on the unit. The housing had been pried open. Avron's breath caught. He had expected this, but the confirmation still struck him. Within the containment unit, a stone setting was suspended just above eye level. It was held in place by 2 steel pyramid structures, one that came from the floor and another that dropped down from above. The unit was built to contain a stone with unpredictable and potentially dangerous power. The setting was empty. The stone was gone. Ibali, you're alive. A soft but commanding voice came from the entrance. Avron yelped as he spun to face the newcomer. The man was wearing a lab coat and a Sombrite device like Avron's. The light illuminated him in the doorway. He was tall, with dark skin and spectacles that ringed his pale green eyes. His hair was twisted into dreadlocks that fell over the right side of his face. Dale Bilan was the head researcher and Avron's direct superior. Despite his age of 32, which was 10 years younger than Avron himself, Dale had the quiet presence of a seasoned leader. He didn't struggle to command respect or obedience. I hoped more of the research staff had survived, Dale said as he calmly strode into the carnage-filled room. The attacks were simultaneous, across the whole facility. Few personnel that were on duty are still alive. The whole facility? Avron breathed. How? Our defenses? Were completely bypassed, Dale interjected. They used Aphosite to sneak past our soldiers, and Granolith to knock out our stone capabilities. I suspect that's why none of the lamps are working. Avron felt a new wave of nausea. Aphosite and Granolith. For the whole facility. The attackers spent a fortune on this assault, and it had paid off for them. How long were they planning this? Dale waded into the blood pool and stepped up beside Avron. He peered into the containment unit and was silent for a moment. So, they got the composite, he whispered. After all our preparation and security measures, we couldn't weather a surprise attack. And now they have it. This attack, Avron managed. Was this Varakar? Of course, Dale replied, scornful. Who else knew this facility was even here? Only our people and theirs. We were careless. He looked down at the floor. Avron followed his gaze, laying his eyes once more on the gruesome scene at his feet. His friends, his colleagues, butchered and strewn about the room. He wondered if they fought back, if they struggled. He squeezed his eyes closed, trying to banish the image of his friends raising their hands in defense of themselves before being brutally cut down. Come, Ibali, Dale said, turning to leave. Varakar has the composite and a head start. We must work fast to retrieve it and take it to the ziggurat before its true capabilities are discovered. We will need to mobilize a task force. That'll take too long, Avron said softly. Dale turned back to look at him. We don't have any other options. We may have one more option, Avron hesitated. This was one mountain of a favor to call in, but Dale was right. No matter what, they could not let the composite's power become the tool of Varakar. I've maintained an old contact from my days as a spirit. He lives just north of the border between Varakar and Acheron. Dale's green eyes seemed to pierce Avron, pinning him in place. A contact, Dale asked. An asset, Avron replied. One who's done work for me in the past, highly effective. The shadows have a half a day's head start, Dale said. The last shift has covered their tracks. We don't know where they're going. The asset is a Pathfinder, Avron said reluctantly. A retired spirit wasn't supposed to keep any contacts they had made through the course of their work. It was to ensure the safety of those involved, as well as maintain a centralized flow of information. Avron could get into big trouble for this, and the thought of being punished made him tremble slightly. But Varakar had made a bold move. His friends were dead, and soon the rest of Karana might be similarly threatened. Avron would do this. A Pathfinder can locate the Shadow's trail and find the composite, Avron asserted. This asset specializes in infiltration and extraction. He can recover the composite and be across border mountains in half the time it takes a team of spirits. We can still mobilize a task force in the meantime to provide support. Dale looked at Avron for what felt like a long time. Avron felt like he was being measured by some metric he didn't know. How certain are you that this Pathfinder can be trusted? I saved his life, Avron said quickly. The code of the Pathfinder considers a life debt to be sacred. He will do this for me, I swear it. Dale nodded curtly. Contact him then. Tell him only what he needs to know. The shadows have stolen something valuable and are fleeing west to Varakar. Tell him to pick up the trail, track down the object, bring it directly to Zarkram. Do not mention the word composite. The fewer people that know the stone's true nature, the better. Understood, Avron said, anxious. Dale nodded again and turned away. Grab your things and clear out. This facility has been compromised. I will have our surviving research materials, and our dead, transported back to Oxorum. This facility will remain under surveillance. Avron hurried out of the lab and stumbled down the hallway. He reached his quarters and began to dig through his old boxes. His hands were still crusted with blood. He ignored that. He once again had a mission, and as anxious as it made him, he would not be deterred. His hand closed around a palm-sized stone setting with a copper-colored chain threaded through a loop in the top. Within this setting was a stone, off-white in color, with swirling striations on the surface. Avron placed the chain over his head and twisted the ring on the setting. The setting depressed the stone at the center, and Avron began to feel the old familiar itch in the back of his skull. Rao, he thought. Rao Sesh, Pathfinder, can you hear me? Avron, is that you? Rao, listen closely. I have a way for you to pay off your debt to me. Part 1. Adventures.